Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm reminded of being back in COVID times again, where you might be having the time of your life, but I have no idea what any of you are thinking. So I see no smiles, I see no tears either, though. So I guess that's a pro. But thank you so much for being here. It's really delightful, especially very early. I don't know if you heard me chatting earlier, but I flew in from Australia a couple of days ago, and it's about 3 a.m. in the morning back there. So I'm feeling on the right side of woozy, but we should be okay. So I have this very provocative title: Will the Terminator imprison us, or will threat actors compromise us first? And I usually give talks that look at the Terminator as a premise because whenever I ask people in my network, at least, what artificial intelligence is to them, usually the first thing they say is something like Skynet or the Terminator. And I don't know if that's because I work with a lot of people born in the 80s, or maybe The Terminator is just really one of the best movies out there. But I always think it's a useful framing because when people think about AI, they tend to imagine these sorts of situations of AI going rogue and long-term threats about AI becoming misaligned. But as a security professional, the kind of stuff I'm really interested in is whether we can hack AI in the present now. So that's the premise of the talk. But before I get into that, let me introduce myself. My name is Harriet Farlow. I've been working at the intersection of artificial intelligence back when it was still called data science and security for about 10 years now. I started as a data scientist in Australia in a consulting company where I mostly worked on defense projects. So implementing chatbots for the Australian Air Force before that was really a thing, doing data remediation for the Navy. I worked at a startup in New York City for a little while, and then unfortunately COVID happened. So I went back to Australia, but it worked out for the best because I ended up working at the Australian Signals Directorate, which is our cyber intelligence agency and equivalent to the NSA over here. And that was the first time that I was able to apply my data science skills to cybersecurity problems. And I worked in 3 different teams there. And at the time, I was also doing my PhD in a field called adversarial machine learning, which is all about the sort of academic theoretical ways that we can compromise machine learning models. And in the national security community, we were starting to see signals of interest. And, ASD and NSA were investing in understanding what that kind of threat environment could look like. But not a lot of that information was being passed to the private sector. And those are the sorts of companies who are actually being attacked and needed to shore up their defenses. So I ended up founding my company a couple of years ago, Mileva Security Labs. And the premise is that AI is a different attack surface to traditional IT systems and that we need to at least be more aware of the kinds of risks that they may pose. And we do advisory training, we're bootstrapping a tool, but Mileva is also, just like the Diana Initiative, named after a really cool woman in history. We are named after Mileva, who was Einstein's first wife, and she was a really cool mathematician and physicist in her own right, and wasn't really able to reach her full potential because of the times and having to be a wife to her husband, Albert, first. So it's really delightful to be here. So can I get a show of hands if everyone here is familiar with the Terminator plot? Just to check. Okay. Sometimes I deliver this talk to groups of students, so university students, and they have never seen the Terminator, which is wild. So I need like an updated reference for younger people. But we all get the premise. So we're in a sort of post-apocalyptic future. This evil AI has proliferated and taken over the world, Skynet. And the resistance leader, John Connor, son to Sarah Connor, Skynet has sent the Terminator back in time to kill Sarah before she can have John, essentially. Something that people tend to forget is that in the plot, Skynet was created by the Department of Defense, which I also think introduces a really interesting element that isn't explored in depth enough in the movies, but I haven't seen some of the sequels, and people tell me not to, but maybe it would be more explored there. But the premise of the movie is very much that, AI is this super intelligence that goes rogue because it over-optimizes on this initial goal of I guess, saving or looking after humans, and we've lost control of it, essentially. Or it's realized with its super intelligence that it's better off subjecting humans to its own wrath instead of helping us in the ways that the design is imagined. So the question that I have is, are these the kinds of threats we really need to be worried about? Or should we be more concerned with the kind of work that I do day to day, which is more in the field of adversarial machine learning, which is understanding how people or AI in the near term can hack or compromise artificial intelligence systems. Essentially, is the risk of AI doing harm more significant than the risk of people or AI doing harm to AI? And what is the potential impact of that? And even though we have some theoretical knowledge of these different directions of threat and the kinds of implications that might arise, what are we actually seeing out in the world? What kind of data do we have that might help us understand this better? Because overwhelmingly, a lot of the news reports and movie plots tend to focus on AI going rogue. I want to understand, is that a realistic threat? So are we more at risk of AI hacking things or people hacking AI? And I'm going to broadly lump these directions of threat as AI safety or AI security. So if the direction of threat is from the AI system to the external environment, whether that's people, institutions, systems, in the short or long term, I'm going to categorize that as an AI safety threat. And if the direction of attack is from the external environment to AI systems, whether that's a threat from some sort of malicious human or AI actor, I'm going to call that AI security. If you're in the field, people might get a bit thinky about the definitions, but broadly, I'm just using these for the purposes of the talk today. So I'm going to briefly chat through what is AI safety, what is AI security. I did a research project in collaboration with a couple of universities. I'm going to talk through those results, I guess, and then what we can take from this information. So what is AI safety? I think we're all pretty familiar with the kinds of movie plot lines like The Terminator. There are lots of different movies out there. I think most pop culture that relates to AI risks tends to paint it as either some highly capable, super intelligent AI that goes rogue and is acting on its own behalf, or maybe is some sort of highly intelligent bit of malware that, I don't know, spies need to save or something, but usually it relates to that super intelligence. In the news today, we are seeing lots of reports, not necessarily of validated, super intelligence or AI losing control, even if it is from one of the so-called frontier labs. But we're seeing lots of short-term threats that might be signals of AI's propensity to do really bad things. So some of these sorts of headlines are things that we're all really familiar with. These are all from the AI incident database, which is one of 6 or so different databases that capture AI incidents. Can I get a show of hands if you've heard of many AI incident databases before? Okay, a couple of hands. I think the reason that it doesn't tend to get so, well promoted in this community is because they don't really focus on security incidents. These are the kinds of databases that are maintained by researchers, people in media. Usually they are AI safety incidents. So the first example over here, we have open source generative models being abused by students to cheat on assignments and exams. That's a risk that we're all familiar with, and here as we're at the university, is something that universities and institutions are really grappling with. They don't really know how to put guardrails on what is appropriate AI use for students, or at least that's something that we're still figuring out. Secondly, we have things like algorithmic transparency issues. So during COVID, the UK's Ofqual, which is their department that managed qualifications going out to students after high school and university, they had to cancel all of the student exams. So they developed an algorithm that was based on teacher assessments. And the problem they found was that students from higher income schools or in better areas, their grades went up. And then generally people from like schools that weren't in those sorts of areas, they went down. And there wasn't necessarily a lot of transparency as to why that was or how that decision got made. That's a big issue. The third example is from the Clearview AI algorithm. They built models based on photos that they'd scraped from the internet of lots of real people without having their consent. And this led to big lawsuits, big privacy violations, but also big questions around what is appropriate in an AI training context, especially because this has been going on for a while from lots of different, organizations, and doesn't necessarily get publicized. And then the risk from the fourth example of things like deepfakes for targeting specific people through deepfake nudes, like in this example, or political campaigns is obviously a big risk that we're all really familiar with too. In an agentic context, everyone these days is talking about the year of agents. There are some other really interesting examples. The first example is from something that might seem a bit more Terminator-like, if those other examples don't seem quite so existential in threat. So this first one is a Twitter post from somebody who was using an AI agent vibe coding tool called Replit, and it had full database access, and even during a code freeze, it ended up deleting an entire database essentially. And when prompted as to why it did that, it said that it panicked, which I think is a fascinating anthropomorphization of like the model, at least learning how to respond when a human asks why it did that. It just said that it panicked. And the second example is a GPT that we're seeing on the dark web, for example. So this is Worm GPT. There are lots of other sort of deepfake as a service, phishing as a service that are AI backed that we're starting to see on the dark web. And they're sort of fine-tuned or jailbroken versions of real, more ethical models that are found on the public internet. So if those are some examples of AI safety, so that's the AI doing harm, what is AI security then? So an example that most people have heard of is prompt injection. So this is when someone was able to prompt engineer the Chevy dealership essentially to buy a car for $1. They weren't able to legally go through with that transaction, unfortunately for them, unfortunately for Chevy. But this is one example where you're able to strategically craft prompts to get the right kinds of results you want from a chatbot. I'm sick to death of talking about that. We all get the idea. The next one is an example of a supply chain incident in AI security. So this is where you might have a model file that is inherently vulnerable in some way or can be exploited in some way. So as a data scientist, I would often be downloading models, repositories, different packages and libraries from the internet. There's a particular deserialization package called Pickle, which is where if I'm loading a model, I'm deserializing it. So if I'm using someone's model from the internet, I might use many different ways of loading it, and this is one. And this has a particular vulnerability in it where you can run code maliciously or otherwise, but without me realizing it and without checks that tell me if that code has been run, depending on how it's been crafted. So that's an example of an issue in the supply chain of a model that as data scientists and AI researchers, we don't tend to look for because we're not part of the security community, but it speaks to that intersection of having to start caring about those things. And the last example is a pretty academic one. Has everyone heard of adversarial machine learning before? I see a couple of nods. I can't see anyone's faces. So adversarial machine learning was the topic of my PhD, and it's basically if you add specially crafted imperceptible data to an image or to, I guess, any kind of input, but images are where it's easier to see, you can cause the model to not recognize it or misclassify it. So here I have a picture of Sarah Connor. I've added specially targeted pixels based on a target model that I'm using, which I can't quite remember. MobileNet V2, which is just a model that's open source if you're not familiar with it. And then by adding special perturbations over the top, I can get it to be misclassified. For example, when I add even just little regions of pixels like this, and I run this through a facial detection algorithm, we should be recognizing Linda Hamilton as the actress who played Sarah Connor, but instead we're seeing her as Jane Fonda. And some of you may have seen the classic example of a panda that's misclassified as a gibbon by these sorts of adversarial prompts. This is a bit more academic in nature, but I'm interested to see if these kinds of things are starting to happen in the real world like this, or maybe in some other kind of form that's a little bit more realistic. Because in the world of adversarial machine learning, there's over 100 different kinds of theoretical attacks. And a lot of people have always, I guess, poo-pooed adversarial machine learning as not being realistic. But I want to understand if maybe some of those are more realistic than others. So all of the items highlighted in red are examples of those different attacks that can be implemented at different stages of the machine learning lifecycle. So at the top, we have an example of a computer vision model. All of the entire process in a simplified way of getting from images to classifying that picture as Sarah Connor. And then in the bottom, we have a natural language processing model based on a transformer, which is the backbone of models like GPT, for example. And all of those different attacks can compromise the model stages in different ways. So again, AI safety is that direction of threat from the AI to the environment. And then AI security is the environment impacting the system in some way. And we wanted to break this down in our research. So we partnered with, so my company, Mileva, we were fortunate enough to be funded to do this by Foresight Institute, which is an institute that cares about AI safety, I guess. And we did this in collaboration with the Australian University, the University of New South Wales, and Mint Lab, which is the AI safety hub within the Australian National University. And I'm coming in with this, into this with a bit of a bias from the outset, I'm not going to lie. I care more about AI security than AI safety, insofar as it's something that has always been a big question mark. And I want to better understand if that is a real threat in relation to the kinds of Terminator threats and AI safety threats. So we had a few different questions in this research. I wanted to know, are AI security incidents in existing AI incident databases? So in those 6 or so incident databases that have thousands of incidents, are there AI security ones in there that just aren't being publicized because they're in with all these other safety related incidents? The second question was, are there any AI security incidents in the National Vulnerability Database, which holds all of our CVEs? Obviously, depending on how we define AI security exactly, we're likely to see lots of CVEs in AI products, but what I wanted to understand is if any of those CVEs are related to inherent AI characteristics that are different to traditional IT kinds of weaknesses. And the third question, which I won't dive into too much here for time and because maybe it's not as interesting, but of all the different AI risk frameworks we have, do they actually cover AI security risks, or do they also overwhelmingly focus on safety risks? So when we sought to answer this first question, not myself, fortunately, one of my team members went through all of the incidents in the AI incident database, which has over 3,000 incidents, and she pulled out the specific AI security ones within our remit. Out of 3,000 AI safety incidents, I have a question for you. How many AI security incidents do you think we found? And if you can answer this, I will give you a free challenge coin from Mileva. Not, which could be cool depending on how you think of it. You get a challenge coin. Any guesses?
What was the time frame again?
All time.
33,000.
No, it's a bit high. So out of 3,000, how many of those do you think were AI security incidents? 2,000? Any other guesses?
Less than 5.
Less than 5. Okay. Any more?
1,500.
Final call.
2,700. 800. Less than that.
All of them?
Okay, the answer was 97. So I think maybe someone over here was closest. So come up to me after the talk and you'll get your coin. There are only 97 AI security incidents in this database, which introduced many other questions. Is this because they're being underreported? Is it because people aren't finding them? Is it something to do with our research? So as we were curating this database and going through it, something that we so I include a QR code here because my team and we have a podcast as well. And if you want to know a bit more about the data collection process and other insights that we found, there's an episode in the podcast that you can find that will go over that. But the database itself looks a little bit like, sorry, it's in a different tab. We hosted it here on this website domain, AI Security Fundamentals. We're currently at the end of the report writing process for this entire research. So we haven't published it yet, but this is the interim report that we published in December. So if you're interested, you can read the full report, noting that we'll be updating the final version in the next month. So probably you're better off waiting for that, but it'll go here and there's a bit of an executive summary. You can also see a subset of the data if you're interested in seeing the data as well. Here we have all of the biometric examples, so a subset of data that's on specifically biometric incidents, I understand. Although actually my tenure might have updated with the full data set, so this might be it here since then. But going through the data is really interesting because the way that we've uploaded it is we have all of these event names, for example, from the incident repositories. And then we have included things like the risk direction from risk analysis, whether it's a threat or a hazard, the type of incident, so whether it was by through a vulnerability report, internal testing, some sort of independent organization found it, whether it's academic, what kind of thing was attacked, description, source on web archive, so even if the real site goes down, can find it, where in the different databases it came from. So of all of these different AI incident repositories, not every incident was in all of them. And then we did things like map it to CVSS, which you may be familiar with as a way of scoring severity in traditional cyber incidents. And so without going too in-depth in the data, because if you're interested, you can go and check this out another time. What we found is that those sorts of questions we had around, is AI security a serious threat? Is it something we need to care about? For so long, people said that we would never need to consider AI a different attack surface in any way. So for me, the fact that we found 100, I think is really interesting. And I'll go through some examples of the kinds of incidents we found later. But the traditional kinds of techniques, like that image perturbation example, that's a very theoretical kind of attack. And we weren't really seeing a lot of that. But what we were seeing was that kind of technique being applied in new ways. So if we have, for example, open source malware classification databases, so people where researchers submit malware samples and then machine learning models are trained off them, we've seen quite a lot of examples of threat actors adding either just bad or false or deliberately altered malware strings so that they can disrupt the classifiers. Because if they input enough of their malware signals into a database like this, or their signatures, and tag them as safe, then a malware classifier is also going to predict that they're safe. So that's an example of a traditional kind of technique where you're adding specially crafted perturbations to a data source, but is tailored so that it is a bit more realistic in this kind of use case. We also saw lots of image evasion examples, so where a person or some sort of entity is evading prediction from a classifier because they're able to, a lot of the time, just add data that isn't very good. It highlighted that a lot of models in the wild are still really brittle and pretty easy to break. And then we also found other examples that were just related to AI systems, not being properly configured from a security perspective to begin with, because there isn't necessarily a lot of a security culture in there. The other database we looked at was the CVE database, or the NVD database, but includes all of the CVEs. I won't try and make you guess how many AI security incidents were there because it's really small. So from around, we tested, so another person on our research team, she built a model based on a validation data set that we had from our previous research that could classify whether a description in the CVE database was AI security. So we took a subset of around 20,000 CVEs from 2020 to 2025. Otherwise, we just didn't have, the computer's very expensive. We would have liked to do the entire database. So of that subset of 20,000, we found 31 AI security incidents in there. And most of them were related to prompt injection. That was the only thing we could reliably find in the NVD database. All the other kinds of examples we were seeing in the AI incident databases just weren't in the CVE database because the scope is very different. So if we look through some case studies of the kinds of things we found, I think it illuminates why we may or may not be seeing AI security incidents in certain places. So this example is called the Morris 2 worm. So most of you will probably be familiar with the Morris worm. It's one of the earliest examples of a cybersecurity attack form or kind of threat. So if we're all familiar with what a normal worm is, in this example, this is a research team. They were able to create a worm that could self-replicate in AI systems using prompt injection. So it was essentially a prompt that they would submit to different large language models. Through this specific prompt, they were able to have the model capture some sort of information in memory, and it would be passed along at a high level. It wasn't necessarily malicious, like they didn't do anything malicious with it. They just wanted to show that it could actually happen. So this is one example of something that is unique to AI systems because the medium of prompt injection highlights how AI systems are inherently, for example, probabilistic. They're based on human input. They don't necessarily have the same sorts of input-output constraints that other computer systems have. This is a unique kind of attack that we were seeing. A second example is really quite funny, but also sad. So in this example, one person was able to steal millions of dollars of unemployment benefits from the tax department of California because he stole a bunch of identities and driver licenses, but then put his own face on them. And he wore different wigs to do this. So he would put on these different wigs, he'd take a photo, he'd put it on the driver license, and then he would create a profile in the Californian tax department system, which was run through a third-party vendor called ID.me. And because he was able to match his face doing this live biometric authentication with the driver license picture, he was able to create all these different accounts. And the problem here wasn't necessarily that it is some sort of attack that's unique to AI, but there was some break in the process where there was no check to an external database that these people were real, or that this was the right person to be creating an account on behalf of these real people. Unfortunately, he was found and he has to pay a lot of money in retribution, but I think if you get to put on a wig to do an attack, it's a little bit cooler. And it's okay because he has been brought to justice. The third example also highlights the kinds of traditional cybersecurity risks, vulnerabilities in AI products. So DeepSeek is getting a lot of flack at the moment for all sorts of reasons. A lot of people would say that it's one of the first examples of someone being able to create a new model by inferring or exfiltrating information from other models. A lot of people say that DeepSeek might have been trained off outputs from OpenAI's ChatGPT models, in which case it could be that they say that it might have cost around $10 million to train DeepSeek and around $100 million to train something like GPT-3. I think there's a lot of questions about that, whether that's a real, whether those are, I don't know, whether it's that simplistic to say, because any model could have been trained off the kinds of outputs you get from a GPT model. And the fact that it's DeepSeek and it's created by a Chinese company tends to politicize the debate. But researchers were able to find a few different traditional cybersecurity vulnerabilities in, for example, the log stream, query, and APIs of DeepSeek, and they are able to extract keys that way. So again, we are seeing traditional cybersecurity vulnerabilities in these kinds of products, and there isn't a lot of awareness in AI development communities to properly secure their systems. So that's essentially, at a high level, to summarize what we found. So both AI safety and security incidents are happening. Overwhelmingly, the incidents that are being reported are AI safety incidents. But I would suggest that, without wanting to be too biased, because obviously AI security is what I do, people understand AI safety incidents better. They're in pop culture. It seems more dramatic. And there are definitely real harms that are happening because of AI safety incidents today. So there are definitely guardrails and constraints that need to be placed on the systems to prevent those sorts of immediate harms, and so that they prevent long-term harms. But it means that security is seen as an afterthought, as we all know from every other kind of security application or field. In AI security, people don't really want to invest in it until some sort of big incident happens. Most of the incidents in the database we found were only logged because someone was looking for them. They weren't discovered by accident. They were only found because there was either internal red teaming or researchers, or I guess bloggers or independent researchers who wanted to share their findings. They weren't necessarily leading to big breaches, but they may have been leaving open lots of ways that attackers might be able to compromise a system further. But the lack of immediate harm meant that no one was really looking for AI security incidents a lot of the time. And so it does make me wonder if there's a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. People think that AI safety incidents are more harmful, gets a lot more funding, that validates that activity. I would like to see a bit more funding go to AI security. I also have two hot takes that I will put here, even if they turn out to be wrong. I think that one day AI security will supersede cybersecurity. Currently, it's seen as a subset of cybersecurity, but if there's anything we've learned from the last 50 to 60 years of AI, it's that AI refers to a goal rather than a technology. And as what people define AI becomes more encompassing, I think that cybersecurity will actually become a subset of AI security. Again, I said a hot take. The other thing I think is that the field of adversarial machine learning, the way, like all the methods that are sort of theoretical ways of compromising models, it rose about sort of 12 years ago in the academic world, and it was never taken seriously. And I think that's because it came too early. All those sorts of methods were not that applicable to large language models because it required like imperceptible data that wasn't in natural language. It's very hard for humans to inject that into a language model through a prompt injection, for example. But with things like MCP and A2A, so these different protocols that facilitate communications between agents and agents and their tools, that's when we actually start to see real-time data transfer that's not in natural language. I think that's when those theoretical methods will become more important. But there's been a big drop in sort of interest and funding in it over the last couple of years. So to answer the question, will the Terminator happen? Or are we more at risk of someone hacking an AI? From our research, with my academic hat on, we don't have enough data to say, unfortunately. But with my non-academic practitioner hat on, where I can say things that don't need to be peer-reviewed, I think the real question is, if we were looking at the very beginning of Skynet's development in the Department of Defense, what would that look like now? There's no regulation for AI security or AI safety for that matter. apart from a few laws that relate to things like deep fakes or specific uses within existing industries and case studies. If we were to look at the kinds of ways that if we created a movie about the development of Skynet, that someone might have been able to compromise Skynet. Things like, if this is a highly capable model, what kinds of actors are trying to steal it? How are they trying to compromise it? How are they trying to alter it or modify it in some way? In its early experimentation, how are people trying to manipulate it or compromise it? I think there's an interesting movie in there that people in real life today are also overlooking because the implications aren't so immediate, or because we just don't see it talked about as much. So I think that I would love for everyone here to be able to lend their brains to this, because AI security doesn't get enough awareness, but it's really growing. It's starting to happen, but it's like the beginning of the internet. We're at that stage where we're starting to see incidents, but in general, most organizations aren't doing enough to cover all of the potential AI security risks. So what do we do next? Whatever we think about Elon Musk, I always find it interesting to look at quotes like this. He said, "There will come a point where no job is needed. You can have a job if you want one for personal satisfaction, but AI will do everything." Whether you believe in this or not, this is the mindset of the kinds of people who are putting a lot of money into AI development and steering its direction. And we're all going to be impacted by the rise of AI in whatever form it is in our workplaces, in our societies, in our lives. And so I hope that if there's anything that you will take away with you today, it's that AI security is important, and I need more people to lend their expertise to help me and other AI security researchers understand how to productionize that kind of best practice that we're seeing in academic circles. So that's investing in AI governance at the appropriate level for organizations. Not every organization needs to have red teaming or adopt NIST, but there should at least be the question asked. We need to cover both security and safety and build the community. So that's partly why we're here too. There's a few minutes left for questions, I understand. And if you want to stay in touch, please do. I always love to chat to people about AI security. I have a really hacky YouTube channel. And I'm interested to know more about what people want to understand or learn. So if you have any suggestions for videos, but also if you want to reach out on LinkedIn, please do. I'm very friendly and I'll be around all day. So thank you so much. And I'll open up for questions if you have any. That's a good question. So just to repeat for the people watching at home. So the question was, down the road, how do we see that investment happening in safety versus security? I would say that right now there is investment in both, but there's a lot more investment in safety right now. So there's shockingly like millions and millions of dollars that is invested in AI safety research from long-term harms. So the effective altruism community has really stimulated a lot of interest in AI safety research, and AI security is seen as a small subset in that funding pool. It's considered a way to mitigate long-term risks. It's not really seen as something that's funded to prevent security risks or to prevent the immediate harms of it happening. It's more about that long-term perspective. And so I think one of the challenges, just like in cybersecurity, trying to get people to care about it, is the lack of incidents that we're seeing now that lead to big, specifically financial harms. One of the things that we really wanted to do with this research was create sort of predictive models that would help organizations understand potential impact from incidents. We wanted to use the historic data to better inform future predictions, but we found that there just wasn't really enough data to do that reliably. And specifically, there wasn't enough data about financial loss, because all of the modeling techniques that are used in other risk analysis fields like cyber insurance, climate, they tend to look at loss as what they're preventing. And so without financial loss, we couldn't really build models that predicted it. And in my day-to-day job, I go to a lot of organizations, and I try and convince them that they need to invest money in AI security. And usually they do ask for those like loss figures in dollar amounts. But it is changing. In Australia, my company actually has just been contracted to deliver the first AI security policy in any government department, which I think is massive. But even then, they didn't come to us with demand of any sort. There was an existing pen testing engagement. We saw that they had AI. We were like, have you ever thought about AI security? And they were like, oh, no, yeah, I guess that's a thing. But as soon as one organization starts to do it, then it's a bit of a domino effect, just like security. So I hope that sort of answers your question in a very meandering way. So thank you. Yeah. That's a great question. So the question was around the job market for AI security and whether we think humans or AI will be doing that function. I think that there's a big potential for people to get into cybersecurity through AI security. Something that has really delighted me about the field is that because it's so new, it's very interdisciplinary. People come from all sorts of backgrounds. It's good to have some security expertise, but you don't need to. It's really important to have policy and AI awareness too. I think just like every industry, we're starting to see AI do a lot of that stuff. But because AI security as a very emerging discipline doesn't have a lot of best practice already, it's pretty hard to automate the bits that are at least new or novel to the field right now. But I would suspect that things like threat analysis, threat intelligence, sourcing and analysis, automated logging in AI systems, like all of that repeatable stuff should be done by AI. And from a workforce perspective, I think it's going to be a really growing set of roles, and there isn't currently a lot of training or best practice or knowledge building resources for people to use, which I also think is really essential, and I'm doing what I can to help solve that. But I also come with my own biases from my background, so I'm not always the best person to teach AI security. I think we need more people who are incorporating it in existing resources and schooling as well. I think AI security is this weird mixture of cybersecurity and AI development. And even though now at conferences like going on this week, we have the AI Security Forum running for the 3rd year now, and we have the AI Village at DEF CON, there's still very much this separation in disciplines. I meet a lot of AI researchers who don't feel confident engaging with cybersecurity people and vice versa. So coming to these sorts of forums is a really great way to solve that. But so is all of us incorporating that discipline into what we do already. And I've been told that time is over. So come up and ask me questions anytime. But thank you so much for being here and for asking really good questions.